At 61 years old, Michelle Obama, lawyer, mother, and one of the most recognized women in America, found herself accused of contempt of court. Across from her sat 9 Supreme Court justices, cloaked in black robes, eyes cold with judgment. At their head was Justice Amy Coney Barrett, wielding her gavel like a weapon, declaring that Michelle's words against a controversial court ruling were dangerous and possibly criminal. But instead of apologizing, Michelle did the unthinkable. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a 15-page legal argument built on 7 historic Supreme Court cases. Her voice rang out, challenging centuries of silence forced upon those who dared to speak against injustice. Her arguments didn't just defend her own freedom. They threatened to expose hidden truths about racism, power, and the fragile line between law and tyranny. Was this justice, or the ultimate betrayal of everything America claims to stand for? And could a single voice expose the hidden racism and injustice lurking even in the highest court of the land? The news hit the West Wing like a thunderclap, echoing down marble corridors lined with presidential portraits and the faint smell of burnt coffee. One junior staffer nearly spilled her latte on the president's dog, who yelped and darted under the resolute desk, while another aide frantically tried to close 3 browser tabs titled "Contempt of Court, What Happens Next?" before anyone noticed. The usually composed press office was now a swirl of panicked whispers, furious typing, and the nervous clatter of high heels on polished floors. Over the muffled roar of printers spitting out emergency talking points, one senior advisor leaned close to another and whispered, "Did Michelle really tell the Supreme Court they're wrong? Has she met Justice Barrett?" A young intern, eyes wide as saucers, replied, "My mom says Michelle's been a queen since the White House days. I think she'll be fine." Another staffer hissed back, "A queen doesn't usually face jail time for contempt of court." Their voices dropped as they imagined Michelle Obama, an icon, a mother, a lawyer, the former First Lady, about to go toe-to-toe with the most powerful judges in the land. The absurdity of the scene made it almost comedic, as if the entire White House had become a soap opera overnight. And yet, beneath the humor lay a razor edge of fear that something unprecedented was about to explode. Across town, in the Supreme Court chamber, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The ceilings soared overhead like cathedral vaults, marble columns cold and silent witnesses to centuries of American law, and every breath seemed to echo in the hush that fell the moment Justice Amy Coney Barrett raised her gavel. In a single sharp crack, the sound ricocheted off the chamber walls like a gunshot, cutting through the whispers and shifting every eye to the bench. Justice Barrett's gaze was steady and hard as steel, her voice slicing the silence with words that carried the weight of history and threat. "Mrs. Obama," she declared, enunciating each syllable as if chiseling it into stone. "This court finds your repeated statements about our recent ruling deeply concerning. You stand perilously close to contempt." A collective shiver rippled through the rows of observers. Reporters lowered their smartphones, and even the justices beside Barrett shifted ever so slightly in their seats. Michelle, framed against the grand red drapery of the courtroom, stood motionless, her shoulders squared, her jaw tight. And though her eyes radiated calm defiance, a single tremor flickered across her fingers as they clutched the edge of her leather briefcase. For an instant, the entire chamber held its breath, caught between the majesty of judicial authority and the dawning realization that this confrontation was about to test the limits of power, speech, and race in America. And as the hush stretched longer, an electric question hung in the air, almost palpable. Would Michelle Obama yield to the Supreme Court's demand for silence, or would she fight back and risk losing everything? Long before Michelle Obama stood beneath the marble columns of the Supreme Court, she was a 20-something law student who struck both fear and affection into the hearts of her classmates. At Harvard Law, she was the student who would raise a hand mid-discussion and coolly declare, "Your argument collapses because you didn't cite your sources properly," sending a ripple of frantic page flipping through the lecture hall. She'd scribble notes with such precision that one classmate swore she could hear the pen humming like a tuning fork. There was the time she rolled her eyes at a student who misspelled Miranda in a moot court brief, hissing under her breath, "Girl, Miranda rights deserve more respect than your ex-boyfriend." The audience can almost see young Michelle tossing her hair, brilliant and sharp, yet secretly eating instant noodles at 2 a.m. because she was too busy outlining constitutional law cases to remember dinner. Fast forward to the White House years, and Michelle's legal instincts never truly faded. Behind the sparkling gowns and speeches, she often stayed up long past midnight, glasses perched low on her nose, flipping through thick law journals while Barack mumbled in his sleep, blissfully unaware. Even amid glittering state dinners, Michelle sometimes couldn't help herself. One story goes that during a fancy banquet with visiting dignitaries, she leaned over to a stunned British official and whispered, "Your argument about trade tariffs, technically incorrect under WTO precedent." These flashes of her legal brain, hidden beneath her polished public persona, make Michelle feel as real as any friend or sister, reminding the audience that the woman standing before the Supreme Court was never just a former First Lady, but a lawyer with a spine of steel. But all the charm and quiet humor vanished the night before Michelle's showdown in the Supreme Court. In a small, book-lined office lit only by the glow of a single desk lamp, Michelle sat rigid in a leather chair, her fingers flying across a battered keyboard. Her brow was furrowed, lips pressed into a thin, determined line as her eyes devoured page after page of legal precedent, cases stacked beside her in precarious towers like sentinels guarding secrets. A quiet rage burned in her chest as she read Justice Barrett's previous opinions, searching for words she could use against the threat looming over her. Somewhere outside, the wind rattled the windows, but Michelle barely noticed. She was too consumed with tracing the threads of history, hunting every ruling that protected freedom of speech, even when spoken against the highest court in the land. At intervals, her breath caught in her throat as she realized the magnitude of what she was about to do. Stand alone before 9 justices and tell them they were wrong. She paused only once to close her eyes, the weight of fear pressing down, remembering the warnings from her advisors. Just apologize. Don't risk everything. But Michelle couldn't, because deep inside, a voice refused to be silent, whispering that the stakes were bigger than herself, that hidden racism, unchecked power, and the fragile promises of democracy demanded someone to speak up. And in that moment, a terrible truth crystallized in her mind. No one truly knew the legal force she was capable of unleashing, not the reporters who covered her fashion, not the White House staffers who assumed she'd apologize, not even the justices waiting to crush her dissent. And as she finished typing her final footnote and saved her 15-page legal analysis, Michelle Obama inhaled sharply, readying herself for war she could not afford to lose. If the White House was rattled, the nation's cable news channels went downright berserk. By dawn, every network was ablaze with flashing graphics and theme music so dramatic, it felt like the country was on the brink of nuclear war, rather than a constitutional debate. On one channel, a square-jawed anchor leaned forward, eyes gleaming as he proclaimed, "Tonight on Firestorm News, is Michelle Obama a secret legal genius, or heading straight to jail in an orange jumpsuit?" Meanwhile, over at a rival network, a bubbly co-host clutched her pearls and gasped, "She's risking prison time, y'all, and for what? Freedom of speech?" Beneath their breathless voices scrolled headlines like ticker tape at a carnival. First Lady or First Felon? Obama versus Barrett, SCOTUS, Smackdown, Supreme Court throws shade. Clips played in split screens. Michelle's confident walk into court looped alongside footage of her dancing on Ellen, as if to suggest the Supreme Court might now rule on her two-step as well. One pundit with a thick Boston accent roared, "If Michelle pulls this off, Harvard should name the law school after her." Viewers across the country were left snorting coffee through their noses as talking heads screamed over each other, each desperate to brand Michelle either a hero for free speech or a reckless agitator threatening the sanctity of the judiciary. And while millions laughed at the media circus, an uneasy edge hung beneath the spectacle, hinting that behind the absurdity lurked a moment that could redefine the balance between power and truth in America. But laughter vanished like smoke when the cameras turned back to the Supreme Court. Inside the solemn chamber, the vast silence swallowed the echo of every footstep, every rustle of silk robes. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, eyes locked on Michelle like twin beams of frost, spoke again, her voice crisp as shattering glass. "Mrs. Obama, you have 7 days to retract your statements and issue a formal apology," she intoned, her fingers curling around the gavel, as though itching to bring it down. "If you do not, this court will have no choice but to refer this matter for criminal prosecution." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, reporters froze mid-keystroke, and even the marble statues seemed to lean closer as if straining to hear. Michelle stood unmoving, her chin slightly raised, the lines around her eyes betraying both exhaustion and blazing determination. For a heartbeat, the tension was so thick it felt as though the chamber itself were breathing. The weight of centuries of law, race, and power pressed down on one black woman standing alone beneath the great seal of the United States. And as the echo of Barrett's ultimatum faded into stillness, the entire nation seemed poised on a knife's edge, waiting to see whether Michelle Obama would bow or become the spark that might set the pillars of American justice ablaze. Standing there beneath the cold glare of the Supreme Court chamber lights, Michelle Obama felt the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. Yet even in the midst of looming catastrophe, a wry smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She leaned forward slightly and whispered to herself, just soft enough that only the marble columns might hear, "They think I'm scared? Please, I've been First Lady. I survived dinner with world leaders who don't believe in deodorant." The absurd memory flickered through her mind, delicate crystal goblets clinking, polite small talk swirling like perfume, and one foreign dignitary whose powerful handshake was matched only by the powerful scent of onions and perspiration wafting off his tailored suit. Even as her pulse thundered in her ears and the possibility of prison loomed larger with every breath, the thought made her want to laugh out loud. It was an incongruous, perfect moment, a small rebellion of humor in a place ruled by solemn tradition and fear, reminding everyone watching that Michelle Obama was not just a symbol, but a human being who, even in the face of threats from the highest court in the nation, refused to lose her sense of self. Yet as the echoes of her private quip faded, Michelle's eyes darkened with resolve. Slowly, she unlatched the brass clasp on her leather briefcase, the sound clicking sharply like the cocking of a weapon. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath as she drew out a thick stack of papers, the edges precisely aligned, the margins crammed with handwritten notes and color-coded tabs fluttering like battle flags. Justice Barrett arched one brow, and Chief Justice William Carter shifted forward, suddenly intrigued despite himself. Michelle inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and spoke, her voice firm and echoing off the marble walls. "Your Honors, I'd like to address the legal standard for contempt of court as established in Bridges versus California," she began, sending a ripple of surprise across the justices' bench. She continued, "In that case, this court held that criticism of judicial decisions, even harsh criticism, is protected by the First Amendment unless it presents a clear and present danger to the administration of justice." Justice Rachel Simmons leaned forward, her pen frozen mid-scribble, while Justice Charles Benton exchanged a sharp glance with Justice Harold Jefferson. Michelle didn't pause, launching into New York Times versus Sullivan, where the court protected uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate, even if it included vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. Her words came faster now, each citation a precise volley in a legal war, her mind clicking through doctrines like a finely tuned machine. "In Craig vs. Harney," she pressed on, "the court made clear that judges are supposed to be men and women of fortitude, able to thrive in a hardy climate, and that criticism of judicial proceedings is not contempt merely because it's harsh." As her voice filled the chamber, the dynamic shifted palpably. No longer was Michelle simply a defendant facing punishment. She was transforming the courtroom into an intellectual battlefield, wielding precedent like a sword. The justices leaned forward, their previous disapproval giving way to reluctant fascination. Reporters' fingers hovered above their keyboards, stunned into silence. In that moment, it became clear that Michelle Obama was not merely defending herself, she was daring the highest court in America to reckon with its own laws, its own history, and perhaps even its own conscience. Michelle could feel the courtroom crackling with tension like a storm building behind stained glass. She paused, lifting her chin with that unmistakable mix of elegance and fire, and let a mischievous glimmer spark in her eyes. "You know," she began lightly, her voice echoing off marble columns, "this isn't the first time a president or someone close to power has had, let's say, strong feelings about the Supreme Court." The gallery leaned in closer, curiosity mingling with disbelief that humor could still find a place in this grim proceeding. Michelle went on. President Andrew Jackson once said of Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. And rumor has it, Jackson said it with a smirk and a glass of whiskey in his hand. A low ripple of laughter rolled through the spectators, hesitant at first, then more genuine as even a few robed justices cracked the faintest of smiles. Michelle flashed a grin and added, "And trust me, folks, if you've ever had to clean up the political mess left after someone says that on the record, you'd know why my hair has so many grays." The moment felt electric. Just a few seconds of human warmth and levity in a room that moments earlier had felt like an iron vault. The laughter reminded everyone watching, both in the chamber and across millions of screens, that even giants of history once sparred with the court, and that challenging authority didn't automatically make one a villain. But the moment of levity vanished as quickly as it arrived. Justice Charles Benton's voice cut through the air like a blade, his tone cool and sharp as glass. "Mrs. Obama," he interjected, leaning forward so that the shadows from the overhead lights cast deep lines across his stern face. "Are you aware that your statements go far beyond mere criticism? You've publicly accused this court of ignoring 70 years of precedent. That's not just disagreement. That's a direct attack on the integrity of the judiciary." A hush fell again, the earlier laughter dying instantly as reporters' fingers hovered trembling over their keyboards. Michelle's eyes narrowed slightly, her face composed but alive with an inner fire, and she clasped the edges of her portfolio as though drawing strength from the weight of the law it contained. "Justice Benton," she began, her voice unwavering, "with respect, I believe my words fall squarely under protected speech as recognized in Garrison versus Louisiana. In that case, the court held that even critical statements about public officials are shielded under the First Amendment unless they are knowingly false or made with reckless disregard for the truth." She flipped a page, fingers steady despite the tremor in the air. "And in Wood v. Georgia, this very court protected a sheriff's right to publicly criticize judges, declaring that public officials must remain open to robust, wide-open debate. My statements may have been sharp, but they were not false, and they were made in the public interest." Justice Benton opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again, his brow furrowed as he glanced at his colleagues, who were shifting, exchanging silent signals. The courtroom seemed to contract around Michelle's words, as though the centuries-old walls themselves were listening. The tension crackled like static, and as Michelle held Benton's gaze without flinching, it was no longer simply a legal proceeding. It was a duel, fought with precedent instead of swords, where the stakes were not just her freedom, but the very definition of truth and dissent in a fragile democracy. As the hearing recessed for a few tense minutes, Michelle Obama stepped into the towering hallway outside the courtroom, the marble walls cold and echoing with every footfall. The weight of a nation's gaze pressed invisibly on her shoulders. Yet as she paused near the heavy wooden doors, her longtime security guard leaned in close, lowering his voice as if sharing state secrets. "Ma'am," he muttered, glancing nervously toward the courtroom, "I'd rather face 5 Secret Service dogs on an empty stomach than one angry Justice Barrett." Michelle blinked at him for a moment before a laugh bubbled up, dry and unexpected, breaking the tension like glass shattering on stone. She grinned and shot back, "Tell me about it. At least the dogs wag their tails when they're done chasing you." The guard let out a snort of laughter that echoed down the corridor, startling a passing clerk who nearly dropped a stack of legal briefs. Even the cluster of reporters lurking at the far end of the hallway paused, cameras forgotten for a split second as they absorbed the sight of Michelle Obama laughing in the face of looming contempt charges. It was a flash of humanity, a flicker of ordinary warmth, reminding everyone that behind the public icon was a woman who could still find humor, even when her freedom and reputation hung in the balance. But the fragile humor dissolved the moment Michelle stepped back into the hushed courtroom. The temperature seemed to drop as Justice Amy Coney Barrett resumed her place behind the bench, her face carved in granite, gavel resting like a silent threat beside her notes. Michelle approached the lectern slowly, the soft click of her heels the only sound in the cavernous chamber, and for a moment it seemed the weight of history itself might crush her spirit. Yet, when she reached the microphone, she lifted her eyes and her voice, calm and clear. "Justice Barrett," Michelle began, her tone respectful, yet charged with something sharper. "I'd like to remind this court of your own words, spoken just 3 years ago at the Notre Dame Law School Symposium." She flipped through her notes, and a hush fell so deep that even the rustling robes of the justices seemed to hold their breath. "It is not disrespect," Michelle quoted, "to question legal reasoning, even that of the Supreme Court. Robust public debate strengthens, rather than weakens, the legitimacy of our institutions." A ripple swept through the chamber as Justice Barrett's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a rare crack in the mask of judicial composure. The sound of shifting seats whispered like leaves in the wind as the justices exchanged glances, startled by the boldness of the maneuver and the precision of Michelle's memory. Michelle pressed on, her voice gaining steel with every word. "Your own words, Justice Barrett, affirm that critical speech, even when sharp, is essential for democracy. My statements were not an attack on this institution's legitimacy, but an exercise of the very principle you yourself defended." The silence that followed was thunderous, loaded with the stunned realization that the tables had turned. For the first time since the gavel struck that morning, Justice Barrett blinked rapidly, her lips parting as though to reply, then closing again in a tight line. In that heartbeat, it was no longer the court looming over Michelle. It was Michelle commanding the court, her lone voice echoing off marble walls as the chamber teetered on the brink of history. By the time Michelle Obama emerged from the great bronze doors of the Supreme Court, the sky was a dazzling blue, the crisp air buzzing with the hum of reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing like strobe lights at a rock concert. But inside the invisible arteries of the internet, America was already ablaze. It began with a single tweet. Michelle Obama just cited 7 Supreme Court cases and left the justices looking like deer in headlights. Legal genius. Within minutes, the hashtag shot to the top of trending charts, joined by others like Justin Supreme Showdown and Michelle vs. Barrett. Memes proliferated like wildfire. One showed Michelle photoshopped in medieval armor, labeled Defender of the First Amendment, while Justice Barrett appeared beside her in the robes of a stern inquisitor. Another meme had Michelle superimposed onto a scene from the Avengers, raising her briefcase like Thor's hammer while lightning streaked across the sky, Justice Barrett recoiling beneath the shockwave. Late-night hosts could barely contain themselves. One leaned into the camera and quipped, "Folks, tonight we learned the truth. The only thing scarier than Michelle Obama's side-eye is Michelle Obama with a legal brief." Studio audiences roared as clips rolled of Michelle at the lectern, edited to drop bars in a mock rap battle. "Yo, Justice Barrett, you can't bury it. My speech is protected, and I'm here to carry it." Meanwhile, TikTok creators choreographed dances while chanting phrases like Bridges vs. California and Craig v. Harney as captions scrolled across the screen. When you thought she'd apologize, but she brought the receipts. News apps pinged phones every 5 minutes with alerts. Michelle's courtroom defense leaves Supreme Court stunned. Some outlets even released instant merchandise, t-shirts emblazoned with the words "Legal Genius" in bold gold lettering, selling out in hours. Yet beneath the comedic spectacle, a deeper current flowed. Pundits on serious panels debated the constitutional questions Michelle had raised. Law professors appeared on cable news, eyes bright with excitement, declaring, "This isn't just a political drama. This is a First Amendment lesson the whole country just witnessed. Even Americans who usually avoided legal news found themselves glued to screens, not just laughing at memes, but wondering, perhaps for the first time, about the boundaries between free speech and judicial power. It was the perfect collision of humor and gravity, a moment where the nation's laughter masked a collective understanding that history had shifted. But while America laughed, the mood inside the Supreme Court remained a study in strained silence. The marble chamber, so recently echoing with Michelle's voice, ringing out legal citations like the peal of a church bell, now felt wrapped in velvet stillness. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat poised at the center of the bench, her posture impeccably straight, but a faint tension pulled at the corners of her eyes. The weight of everything that had transpired seemed to settle around her, like a cloak woven of centuries of legal tradition and sudden vulnerability. She inhaled slowly, a sound barely audible, but somehow deafening in the hush, and then spoke in a voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Mrs. Obama," she said, each syllable falling into the silence like a stone into water, "this court will reconsider." The words hung in the air, vibrating with implications so vast that even the reporters trained to churn out headlines in seconds sat motionless, their fingertips frozen above their keyboards. Across the bench, justices exchanged glances, some quick and anxious, others waited with reluctant respect. Chief Justice William Carter leaned back, his eyes narrowed, as if reassessing not only the case before them, but the woman who had just forced them to pause. It was a moment almost impossible to comprehend. Michelle Obama, a single voice, standing without a robe, without a title, had cracked open a door in the fortress of America's highest court. The same institution that had seemed invulnerable only hours before was now caught in a moment of introspection, grappling with the reality that it might have to reckon not only with constitutional law, but with how the public viewed its very legitimacy. The tension was palpable, pressing down on every breath in the chamber, as if the air itself had grown dense under the gravity of what Michelle had accomplished. The shift was not merely procedural, it was seismic, signaling to every person watching that the balance between power and truth might never quite be the same. And, as the day slipped toward dusk, the sun burning low and golden beyond the Capitol dome, the narrator's voice rose in calm, solemn cadence, weaving together the threads of a story that felt larger than any one person. "One black woman," the voice began, rich and clear, "armed not with armies, nor titles, nor the promise of political safety, but with knowledge, memory, and the courage to speak, shifted the conversation about race, power, and freedom in America's highest court." The words carried a weight that wrapped around the audience, drawing them in closer, inviting them to sit in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The narrator continued, "In a chamber where silence was meant to be obedience, Michelle Obama chose instead to lift her voice. And in doing so, she reminded us that the Constitution is not an untouchable relic locked away in marble halls, but a living promise belonging to every citizen willing to claim it." A gentle pause gave the audience room to breathe, to absorb the magnitude of what had unfolded. She reminded us that dissent is not disloyalty, that criticism does not mean disrespect, and that the power to question authority, even the Supreme Court, lies at the heart of a free people. And sometimes it takes just one voice, unyielding and unafraid, to force even the mightiest institutions to look in the mirror. As the screen began to fade to black, the narrator offered a final quiet reflection. Perhaps the real verdict today was not about Michelle's words, but about who we choose to be as a nation, whether we silence those who speak truth, or listen and grow stronger for it. The closing image lingered. Michelle Obama, standing tall on the Supreme Court steps, the wind tugging at her coat, eyes bright with the knowledge that, though the battle was not over, history would remember that on this day, one woman's courage made even the highest judges in America pause and think. Several months later, the oak-paneled auditorium at Notre Dame Law School was packed beyond capacity, the air alive with murmurs of excitement and the rustle of notebooks as students and faculty leaned forward in their seats. A brilliant autumn sun streamed through tall windows, casting golden bars of light across the stage where two unlikely figures now stood side by side. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, robed and composed, and Michelle Obama, elegant yet relaxed, her laughter ringing clear over the low hum of the crowd. The university had invited them both to speak on constitutional dialogue and the importance of civil discourse, a pairing that only months earlier would have seemed impossible. As the applause died down, Michelle leaned slightly toward Barrett, microphone in hand, and quipped with a playful smile, "Next time, Justice Barrett, just send an email instead of a contempt citation." A ripple of laughter rolled through the hall, punctuated by Barrett herself, chuckling and shaking her head. Her earlier sternness softened into a wry grin. Barrett raised her own mic and replied, "Mrs. Obama, I'll keep that in mind, but you have to promise to keep your legal arguments under 15 pages. The room erupted in laughter, the tension of past battles melting away, replaced by the refreshing spectacle of two formidable women showing the nation that even fierce adversaries could share humor and perhaps even respect across a courtroom divide. In that moment, they weren't simply icons of law or politics. They were two human beings standing on common ground, offering the audience a glimpse of hope that dialogue, however difficult, was still possible. As the lights dimmed and the audience fell into a reverent hush, the narrator's voice rose, warm and steady, carrying the resonance of a story that had transcended a single courtroom drama. "This wasn't just Michelle's fight," the narrator began, each word deliberate and rich with meaning. "It was a reminder that speaking truth to power can change even the highest halls of justice." Images flashed across the screen. Michelle standing defiant at the Supreme Court lectern, the stunned faces of the justices, the memes that captured the country's imagination, and finally, the soft handshake between Michelle and Justice Barrett beneath Notre Dame's soaring arches. The narrator continued, "Michelle Obama proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be silenced, even when the threat comes from the very institutions sworn to uphold our freedoms. She reminded us that the law belongs to all of us, not just to those who wear the robes or wield the gavels. And she showed that questioning authority is not rebellion. It is the very heartbeat of democracy." There was a pause, as though the narrator wanted to let the gravity of those words settle in the hearts of every listener. Then the voice added, gentler now, "In a world so often divided by race, power, and fear, one woman's voice proved that knowledge, resilience, and dignity can shift the course of history. And she left us with this enduring truth. Sometimes, the most powerful revolution begins with simply refusing to stay silent." As the music swelled softly and the screen faded to black, the audience was left not just entertained, but transformed, carrying forward the lesson that no matter how imposing the walls of power might appear, they can still be shaken by one voice, brave enough to speak. The characters Michelle Obama and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, depicted in this story, are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. This narrative is a work of fiction and does not represent real events or statements by these individuals in real life. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful tales of courage, justice, and dramatic showdowns, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps me keep creating the stories you love